So for the third speaker of the session, we now welcome Dr. Blake Morton from the University of Hull, UK, who is going to show that wild raccoons are more innovative but not bolder than another ecological generalist, the Virginia opossum, on a pull string task. So Blake, the floor is yours. You can share your presentation.
Okay, no problem.
Perfect, we see it well.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about a recent study we completed on wild raccoons and opossums. Most of us hopefully are aware we're in a biodiversity crisis, and that stems largely from human-driven activities like climate change and urbanization, both of which are rapidly accelerating. Just to give context, for instance, 2050, they're anticipating that most of the world human population will live somewhere in a town or city. And that exposes wildlife to many unfamiliar or novel situations. And that large ecological footprint alters or potentially alters animal behavior in unprecedented ways. But interestingly enough, some species are nevertheless thriving for reasons that are still not entirely clear. One behavior in particular that's of interest is bold behavior, defined in our study as willingness to engage with unfamiliar and therefore potentially risky situations. So, for example, animals encountering random foraging opportunities that they haven't seen before. Another behavior that's of interest is innovation. They're defined in our study as using a new or modified behavior to solve new or existing challenges. So, for instance, dolphins in Australia using sponges on their rostrum to protect themselves as they comb the ocean floor. So a key challenge, though, is understanding and being able to predict the likelihood of a species displaying both of those behaviors in response to novel environmental changes. And that's very important, obviously, from a conservation management perspective, because, of course, there are too many species or stars in the galaxy, as it were, to focus on. And so knowing a little bit about their behavior can hopefully help us predict where and how they'll potentially adapt. So, for example, managing human-wildlife conflict. But most of what is known about species differences in bold and innovative behavior stems largely from birds and primates. And there's very relatively little representation from other taxonomic groups, particularly in the wild. So carnivores and marsupials are two good examples of this. And so in our current study, what we looked at were two different species, one a carnivore, the raccoon, and then the other one a marsupial, the Virginia opossum. And this is based on a study, again, we just published in Animal Behavior. So if you're interested, there's a lot more that we don't have time for this current presentation, so you can dissect that in your own time. But they're interesting species, we think, because, well, firstly, they're sympatric. So they live together in the same spaces. And that's pretty useful because it allows us to be able to look at them within the same time frame, the same locations. Just logistically, that's more practical. Also, wild raccoon studies are emerging nowadays and showing that they are quite highly innovative, which is really interesting. And the underlying assumption has been that potentially this helps them adapt to environmental changes. But whether or not they compare or how they compare to other competitor species like opossums has not really been tested in the wild. Know that in general, species that display greater ecological generalism often have bolder and more innovative tendencies. And so in the case of raccoons and opossums, if you look at their native range where they're from in North America, we find that raccoons have a larger breadth to their ecological generalism than the Virginia opossum. And we know as well that raccoons are quite famously known as an invasive species. So here in Europe, they're invasive, and in Asia as well, because people brought them there and they did quite well for themselves when put in the wild. So our prediction in the current study was that maybe raccoons behave a little bit more boldly and innovatively compared to Virginia opossums. So we tested this in the United States on the East Coast in North Carolina and South Carolina. And we had 3 field sites. And within or across all of those field sites, we had 135 locations that we deployed puzzle feeders. And they were all spaced over 1 kilometer apart to reduce the chances of the same animals finding multiple puzzle feeders. But one site in South Carolina, we had 61 locations. On the east coast of North Carolina, we had 51 locations, and then the remaining were in a highly urbanized area, Raleigh-Durham, which is the capital of North Carolina. And this allowed us to test both species in quite a range of habitat types. We didn't really want it to be unique to one area. So we tested them in urban and rural, in swamps, in hardwood forests, in coastline, and so forth. Here's what the task looked like. It's a modified version of a very widely used task called a pull string task, or a vertical pull string task. And we set this up in trees and deployed them for 2 weeks, filmed everything when people were not present with trail cameras. So I'll just break down quickly each of those 4 conditions, those string conditions for you. So the first condition was quite a simple one, which is cups with no food inside. All the other cups had food. This one didn't, because we wanted to see whether or not the animals would interact with that particular cup despite visual cues of the food being there. Our second condition was what we considered to be quite easy. It's just a basic string on a cup with food. The food I'll talk about the food in a second, but it was 30 rewards per cup to try and motivate them to engage. A relatively moderate condition, or a moderate difficulty condition, and that was wire and string. So half of it was string, the other half was wire. And we knew going into the study that the wire is quite slippery to the coarse paw pads of both of these animals, so it made it a little bit more challenging if they wanted to try and get to the food. And finally, we had our difficult condition, which was a fully wire cup. And so in order to find an alternative solution, they had to kind of think about it. So for instance, they might have grabbed the wire in the mouth and then walked down the tree, which some of the raccoons did. And also they could potentially hang upside down and stretch as far as their body could take them, but then kind of grab the wire and then swing it up into their hand at the end. So it wasn't as slippery. Just a few little particulars as well about the task. So I mentioned before we used food rewards. So this was dog food or corn, and they're considered high value rewards. These animals, both species, are dietary generalists, and anyone who knows these animals know that they will eat anything and everything. Conditions were counterbalanced at each location from left to right, so they weren't put in a specific order, or we balanced it out across all of our field sites. In terms of species capabilities, both are arboreal, so putting these in the trees was fine. We know as well that captive raccoons can solve string tasks because they have little hands that allow them they're quite dexterous, and they can pinch things and grab things. Opossums have not been tested before on a pull string task, but we do know that opposable thumbs and prehensile tails that allow them to manipulate quite a range of complex objects. In terms of the behaviors we were interested in looking at, we had 3 of interest. The first was whether or not the animals acknowledged, and then touched, and then solved the task by operating the string and getting the food. And we operationalized bold and innovative behavior in this way by whether or not the animals touched and solved the task. We tested inter-observer reliabilities, which were quite excellent. And then we put these data into an analysis to look at the likelihood of a species displaying each of those 3 behaviors. So on the number of locations where raccoons or opossums did or did not display that behavior of interest. So importantly here, our analysis is a population level analysis, not individual based. We weren't interested in traits like personality. We wanted the bigger picture of what goes on in these populations. And more importantly as well, we weren't interested in why they displayed a behavior. Of course, anyone knows that animals that do or do not display a behavior can be underpinned by a myriad of factors. But we really just in the study wanted to look at whether those differences existed. So here's a couple of examples for our behaviors that we saw being displayed by both species. So we don't have time in this presentation to look through all of them, but if you want in your own time, you can check out our publication. There's a link to the video as well, so you can look at all of the behaviors that we saw. So here's one for raccoons. Okay, and I'll just skip over to one for our opossums. So you can see the raccoon reeling in the cup with its paws. And opossums, in this case, were a little bit different. So here's a classic example of when it tried to get as close as it could to the specific cup that it was interested in, but it didn't bother to really manipulate any of the strings. So in terms of our sample sizes across these locations, here you have before you the number of locations that we did to compare or use to compare both species in terms of our behaviors of interest. Of course, these are wild animals, so you kind of get what you get when you deal with them. In terms of the differences, when we look at acknowledgement of the puzzles, we find that both species were equally likely to pay attention to them as they were passing by, that they did acknowledge their presence and showed signs of interest in them. We also found in terms of touching, they were equally likely to touch them as well. But in terms of solving it, we found that raccoons were more likely to solve compared to the opossums. That's when you just looked at the string pulling behaviors, but also if you just wanted to have a catch-all, even when we included all behaviors, it didn't matter. The point was raccoons were more likely to solve it. So importantly, neither species was present at the same time, so they weren't influencing each other. There's a lot more information about that you can dissect in the paper itself. Both species had similar times within the testing area as well. For raccoons, we found no evidence that there was a meaningful difference in terms of their willingness to touch or solve the task as a function of what kind of food we had. We had hoped to test this with the opossums, but there were too few opossums visiting our corn condition to be able to test that. So overall, our findings are consistent with what we would expect based on the published literature around wild raccoons. There's a lot of studies coming out now showing that they are indeed highly innovative, consistent with our results. And in other populations, like in studies by Stanton and colleagues in 2024. We also found in our paper, we found that, interestingly enough, one of the conditions that the raccoons seemed to solve in the first instance was the easier solution, which maps onto what Daniels and colleagues in 2019 found in captive raccoons. Our findings for opossums are also consistent with what scientists have found with other species of opossum. So in the case of white-eared opossums in South America, Alberts and colleagues in 2020 did find as well that they fail a pull string test. And like our Virginia opossums, they too try to grab the food directly without bothering to pull on the strings or interact with them. So we found both species were equally likely to display bold behavior. That's the question of whether or not bold behavior is potentially less important in shaping the niche differences we see between both species, because they're equally likely to display that behavior. Of course, as always, there's further research needed. One thing that we recommend is that it could be that behavioral differences start to emerge when you test them on other kinds of novelty or even larger scale forms of novelty. So we recommend maybe you might try and test this on the periphery of both species ranges, because that's where those populations have the more recent exposure to things that we're not familiar with. So other tasks, of course, as always, other populations. And I think also perhaps larger sample sizes, well, anything in animal behavior, sample sizes are, hard to obtain in large numbers. This is one of the beauties of collaborative science. But in our case, I would say bumping up those numbers is really important, because if you look here, we do see a trend for raccoons to display touching behavior more often than the opossums, but it wasn't significant. In terms of innovation, raccoons were more likely to display innovative behavior. And so one thing we think is maybe this is reflective of the possibility that innovation does help them currently adapt to novel environmental changes. Obviously, in this particular study, we don't have evidence for that, but follow-up studies could look at one thing we might expect if local adaptations are arising. We would expect maybe within species population variation as a function of novel environmental changes. But classic would be, of course, urban-rural differences, and looking at the prevalence of innovation within those different populations. Caveat that, though, of course, this is something that we work over here in the UK with British carnivores. Not all innovative species necessarily will show population differences. So here's a very good paper that does a meta-analysis to show across a range of species that that's not always the case. even in our particular research recently with urban red foxes, we find that urban foxes are bolder, but not necessarily more innovative than their rural conspecifics. But in your own time, if you're interested, you can check out a recent preprint that we've uploaded online that you can look at, where we look at this in a little more detail. What we find is that when you take to account the age of that population, we do start to see urban-rural differences and innovations start to emerge. So in the case of looking at this for urban-rural differences in raccoons, we would recommend knowing a little bit about the age of that population and their time of exposure to urbanization. That's it for now. This is all of our collaborators. I'd like to thank the people who helped us logistically, financially, and also all of my students and RAs who have contributed a lot to the discussions for the work we currently do. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Blake, for this really interesting talk. I mean, the proof is that I have a lot of questions in the chat to relay to you. So the first question by David is, did you have any other species interact with the puzzle traps, or were they limited to just the raccoons and the opossum?
Yeah, that's actually the first time I completely agree with that interesting question. It's the first time anyone's ever asked us that. Certainly in the wild, animals don't live in a vacuum, so there are loads of other ones coming up to these puzzles. In this particular study, the only animals that we had coming up to them were a few black bears. But yeah, but those, because of the distribution of them, they didn't they weren't present at the locations where we tested our target species. We do also find this here in the UK, where we test British carnivores. So look for hopefully an upcoming paper on that in the future.
So then we have another question by Laure. Very interesting talk, thank you. Did you have the opportunity to look at the learning rate as well once they solved the task, since you are presenting 4 cups?
Yeah, so we talk about this a little bit in the paper. I wouldn't call it learning, because I think, to demonstrate learning, you've got to have, more careful controls than what we had. Our study here is simply just behavioral differences. We're not really interpreting the underlying cognition of the animal. So really, to do that, you need to have clear controlled evidence for it. But certainly, I think, these animals are probably learning, and you could, without, going as far as to say what kind or whether learning is taking place, you can at least look at latencies for them to do things. We did test this between the two species, and there was no evidence of a difference between the two in terms of their willingness to approach and interact with the puzzles. So, again, you'd want to have a control, but if habituation is a factor, I don't see any evidence here for that.
Thank you for your answer. So we have another question by Megan. I am curious about the empty cup. Did you have any individual interacting with the empty cup at all? And were there species difference in this?
Yeah, okay, that's a good one, actually. So we didn't have enough of the opossums interacting with that one to test it. But for the raccoons, some of them were doing it. And one of the proposals we make in our paper is that perhaps this suggests that not all of them, but some of them are maybe using odor cues to interact with the puzzles. So it's not just the visual confirmation, which of course you probably would expect, because they are carnivores and they can smell quite well. So yeah, one of our kind of priorities is to learn a little bit more about the perception of all of our study species, which we know very little about, really. And so this is kind of one of the important parts of that study.
So I think I have time for 2 more questions. So there is a question from Jean-Noël. Nice talk. Do you think, speaking about population, that raccoons can solve tasks even more easily when they are not alone? And he adds, I am thinking of the case of hyenas, for example.
Yeah, I think that we did have very few occasions where I think it's in our paper, but I think it was maybe 2 or very few occasions where we saw raccoons together. I know this is contrary to other populations that I'm aware of in North America, which is again why, I would definitely reiterate, we need to test a lot more populations, because, like people, animals vary. And so I think that would be really fascinating. And I would probably guess there's probably some kind of social facilitation going. You can maybe argue both ways depending on the situation. If food is very competitive, you might have more fighting amongst them, or something like that. But yeah, I think like many animals, they probably have some element of facilitation going on.
Yeah, it makes sense. So the last question by Megan. While you didn't have species occurring at the feeder at the same time, did you ever have multiple individuals of the same species at the feeder at the same time? And is there a possibility for social information use? So it's similar to what you just said.
Yeah. So, well, hopefully well, it's interesting you're saying this because we're kind of trying to look at this in our red foxes at the moment. But anyways, yeah. So in the case of our raccoons and opossums, it's been interesting to be able to test these methodologies in two different, in Europe, here in Europe, and in North America, because you get very different ecosystems in the sense of what animals are coming up, the frequency of that. And so in our experience in that part of the United States, you didn't really see a whole lot of biodiversity coming up to these puzzle feeders. Again, you just had maybe some bears coming up, but very rarely. A few birds, but they were clearly not interested in the puzzles. They were just sitting on the tree, like a few owls and a hawk, I believe. And then you had a few occasions, like I mentioned, where a couple of raccoons were together, but they were kind of in the vicinity, but they were not right there at the puzzle at the same time. So one might be on the ground, the other one up in the tree. But whether that, plays a role, I think that's a fascinating and much needed question, but not one we can answer here.
A possibility for a future study.
Yes.
So sadly, we have to move on for the next talk. But thank you, Blake, for this really fascinating story. I invite all the people, all the questions that I didn't pick, to write their question in the channel on Discord, and Blake will answer you there. So okay. Thank you, Blake.
Thank you for your time. Thanks for your questions. All right, take care.